Good morning. It's Alan Holstein, and the purpose of today is to talk about my story and my history, and the audience is for whoever is interested from now into eternity, digital eternity. The starting point of talking about myself is really talking about my father and my family, and in particular, my father and his roots and how it influenced me. He was born in Charleston, West Virginia, a mid-sized city, but he had a grandfather who was a greater influence on him than even his father. So my great-grandfather was named Granville Odell, and he lived up in Appalachia, West Virginia. He was born in the 1850s, and my brother and I went to this place, Hominy Falls, West Virginia, 5 or 6 years ago, and were sort of blown away in today's time in terms of how isolated it was. He had a farm there and a general store, but my father used to summer there when they killed sheep, and they didn't have electricity and didn't have plumbing, and it was a big influence on his life. It was subsistence farming in rural Appalachia. So he grew up, and here comes World War II after the Depression, and he saw the world. So a 22-year-old out of West Virginia traveled on an aircraft carrier from New York to North Africa, and from there on a train to points east, I forget where. But he was in the Allied occupation of Europe, and traveled in France and had that experience, and then traveled to the Pacific and Okinawa and I don't know where all, but he literally saw the world and came back, got married to my mother, Eloise, but he got bit by the bug, so to speak. He had kids and moved us to Los Angeles for a job promotion, and still wanted to see the world and wanted his kids to see the world. And he took us to Yosemite and to Yellowstone and Death Valley, coastal California. We went all kinds of places, Grand Canyon, some of which was like 7 wonders of the world in my small mind, 6, 7, 8 years old, like, wow. But, nature found a place in my soul during that experience. Then for another job promotion, he moved us to Louisville, Kentucky, another mid-sized city, not as rural or hillbilly as the rest of the state. But he brought all those experiences with him. In California, he joined the Sierra Club, which everyone knows is a progressive environmental movement. And when we moved to Kentucky, he became president of the Kentucky chapter of the Sierra Club, which is kind of an oxymoron. But this was during a time where the seeds of environmentalism were being laid. It was also a period of protest against the Vietnam War. And my dad got particularly interested in the Red River Gorge that the Corps of Engineers wanted to dam up. Well, it just so turns out that we hiked in the Red River Gorge and canoed in the Red River Gorge, and before long he was leading a protest march through the gorge, and he and his buddies invited Supreme Court Justice O. Douglas down, and I met the man and his then 20-year-old wife and walked behind him through the gorge in a protest effort against the authorities. And along the way, he went to Washington. I don't know now, was it to lobby or to testify, but it'd be like dinner time. Where's Dad? Oh, he's in Washington. He really got occupied with it while having a full-time job and taking us camping. He met like-minded people through the Sierra Club, which I met, one of which was Wendell Berry, who became a famous author. But I sat around the fire and listened to him and his buddies who hoot and holler about, telling stories and laughing, belly laughs around the campfire when I was, 13. I think another family was the Kingsolvers. Barbara was a daughter who went on these hikes, who also became a famous author. I never met her again, but my dad told me, "Oh, you know that family," when I referenced one of her books. And it was capped off after I graduated from high school and before I went to college. My dad decided to take me and my brother and Ken Wright on a backpacking trip in Yellowstone at a time no one really did that. Not only was it uncommon, we drove nonstop from Kentucky to Yellowstone, trading drivers along the way. It was so unusual that the newspaper from Louisville, Courier Journal, sent a photographer and reporter along on the trip just so they could document what these crazies were doing. But it just sort of put a cap on my quest for nature, and we didn't see another soul except for grizzly bears for a week in the backcountry of Yellowstone. And I walked out weeks before going to college thinking, I want to work with nature. I want this. And so I ended up going to college and getting bachelor's and master's in horticulture at the University of Kentucky. One of my projects was planting a vineyard on a reclaimed strip mine spoil way out in Appalachia. And so I again had opportunity to travel there, but my professor was a real mentor, Carl Chaplin, who said to me, he had a connection at Oregon State, and he said, you ought to check out Oregon, you would like it. He knew about my camping and affinity for nature as well as my interest in horticulture, which I got into with hopes that it would lead to a career of some sort working with nature. And so off I went in my pickup with my then-to-become wife. And I also had applications into UC Davis as well as Washington State. But off I went in my pickup truck and traveled through the Rockies and high desert, stopping along the way to hike and explore, and got to UC Davis where Ken Wright was studying, kind of, and visited the campus where I had an application in and thought, okay, I got it, and came up to Oregon and visited Corvallis and thought, okay, this will work. I'm out of money. The trees are green. The people are normal. And I had an assistantship. I had a connection there, which allowed me to start a PhD program of all things. What was I thinking? At the same time, Ken Wright, of all people, was my roommate in college, and he got a job in a fancy restaurant and started bringing wines from the restaurant home for us to finish off. And at the time, we were, drinking Battus and smoking weed, and he brought home Bordeaux's and things from the restaurant. And we were like, wow. And combined with my interest in horticulture, we began saying, how's this possible? So we even started in the non-credit part of the university a wine tasting appreciation class that we got the university to advertise, and we got all these people, mostly faculty members, to sign up for a wine appreciation. People we'd never met. We went and got a book that talked about the wine regions of the world, and we walked in. Usually it was held in one of the faculty members' home, and we stood up and acted like authorities on the wines of the world. But it gave us another opportunity to try wines on other people's nickel, and gave us an appreciation. Fast forward years when Ken was visiting me in Oregon in Dundee, and we snuck into Knudsen Erath cellar to taste the 1983s out of barrels. And we took a sip out of a particular barrel, and we looked at each other and like, this is what we used to try back in college. This is it. This is the real deal. And a year later, Ken moved up here and and made a giant contribution to the Oregon wine industry. I learned some things as a PhD candidate that I should have learned as a master's, and that was the politics of funding, as well as the fact that when you got a degree, a PhD from a particular institution, they wouldn't give you a job there. You had to go somewhere else. And so I started looking at where those places were, and it was Riverside, California, and East Jesus, Michigan, and Tallahassee, Florida, or whatever. It was places I didn't want to know about compared to being in Oregon with all the nature and beauty it provided. So along the way, while I was at Corvallis, I stopped in an Oregon winery and bought a few bottles off the shelf, which at that time you couldn't get anywhere but Oregon, and thought, wow, this is kind of like some wines Ken and I tried back in college that, to my mind, young mind, had potential. And so I visited one of the Oregon wineries, Knudsen-Erath at the time, and went back later and for a second experience. And the winemaker's wife, who was tending the tasting bar, which was in the garage, said, "Oh, by the way, we're looking for a vineyard foreman," after I explained that I was studying horticulture. And she said, "If you know anyone, tell them." It was like, not you, but if you know anyone, tell them. So I applied and got the job. So I left Oregon State after my second quarter there. I didn't get very far. And there I was, driving up to Knudsen-Erath Winery, fresh out of college without much experience at all. I'd had jobs pruning in the vineyards and every now and then hooking up a piece of farm equipment to a tractor. But there I was in charge of 100 acres of grapes. At the same time, my boss, Dick Erath, and his colleagues, there was 13 wineries in Oregon at the time, and I'd been in rooms where all 13 of them were there. They were collaborating, trying to learn from each other. How do you do this? Some of them were home winemakers. Some had had a course or two at UC Davis, but they really didn't know what they were doing. So they couldn't teach me very well. They taught me many things, but not the fine pieces of the job. It was like, okay, it's out there. The crew shows up at 7, and I thought I would get a walk around with my boss, Dick Erath, but I never did. I had to make it up as I went. I might have been one of the first 3 hired guns. Prior to this chapter where I got hired, the principals, so-called, let's call them the pioneers, the 13 different wineries. It was Knudsen-Erath, Adelsheim, Tualatin, Elk Cove, Amity, did I say Sokolblosser, Eyrie. There was Hillcrest down in Roseburg area, run by the first guy to plant Pinot Noir, Richard Summers, who I met. He was a character. So I didn't know much about equipment, but there I was out driving a tractor like, okay, I'm managing a vineyard now. I remember one experience where there was a particular job that needed to be done. I think it was dropping wires in the vineyard, and a crew showed up, 5 guys saying, "We're looking for work. You have any work?" And I thought I could do all the work myself. And I thought, no, I can't afford these guys. But I didn't know. So I went out and did 1 row by myself and timed myself about how long would it take me to do all this. And it was going to be a week, me doing it by myself. And I didn't have a week. It needed to be done in a day or 2. So I walked back down the hill after doing this 1 row and said, yeah, you got a job. And but you know what? I need a Social Security number, and to hire them, hire them legally. And one guy gave me a number with 8 digits in it. It was all on the back of a match cover, and I wrote it down until I figured out it was 8 digits. And I'm like, hey, buddy, we need another number here. Can I just put a zero? He goes, yeah, put a zero. In Espanol, pone un zero. So I hired him, and it was in a period of acceptance negligence in terms of the authorities. They didn't really pay much attention. So I found my list. It's Adelsheim, Tualatin, Oak Knoll, Honeywood, which is a winery that's still around today. They mostly made fruit wine. Oak Knoll made a lot of fruit wine. Irie, Sogelblasser, Arterbury Marsh, who is no longer in business. Ponzi. So as I said, they were all collaborating, trying to figure out, okay, they were even sharing equipment. They didn't have enough money to buy a press, and so someone would take their fruit to another person that had a press, and it was that basic at that time. The principals, as I mentioned, were mostly romantic types without much technical training. I spent hours on the tractor with no earplugs. You know, OSHA wasn't much of a factor then, but jiggling along in the hillsides sort of damaged my back after time without me really knowing it for decades. And hearing, sometimes I'd get off the tractor and be like, my brain was sort of rattled from the noise. But compared to some of my early heroes, Wendell Berry, for example, who talked about sustainable farming and back to the land and sense of place, I had some of that from the early stages, sense of place, where you belonged. That resonated with me through his writings, and all of a sudden in Dundee, I had that sense of place. It was beautiful, and you could make a living off of it. But I found myself using pesticides because the economics of the situation, as I saw it then, demanded that. We had bulldozers out that I was in charge of pushing down force so we could plant vineyard. So I wasn't near as pure as some of the early examples, but they still influenced me. So that was 1980 when I first started at Knudsen Erath, and along the way in subsequent years, I got moonlighting jobs at Weber Vineyards in different places, working on the side. So I really, along the Warden Hill Road circuit, so to speak, I worked in most of those vineyards and planted quite a few of them along the way. And one of which was Fuquay Vineyard that I helped harvest and I got to know doing odd jobs from time to time. But he was getting a divorce and had to sell some of his vineyard. He had a 20-acre vineyard. He was one of the original vineyard owners. He didn't have a winery, so he doesn't have a lot of name recognition. But he had to sell part of his vineyard, and he said, okay, I'll sell you the top half. And, you know, I was making $6 an hour or $7, and interest rates were 10, 12% or something like that. I was like, okay, yeah, you got to sell it, but how am I going to buy it? And backing up a little bit, Cal Knudsen, who was a mentor and a partner in Knudsen Erath Winery, influenced me towards this end. We were walking through his vineyard one day, and he said, you know what, Alan? For this to work out for you, meaning this job, you're going to have to own something, and I'll help you if you can find it. I'm like, really? You'll help? And that was sort of the trigger that made me think, oh, maybe you could own a piece of this, and maybe you could have a real sense of place. And it got me looking, simultaneously working with Fuquay and Arthur Weber. Arthur Weber offered to partner with me on it. I was that young and that poor. He also felt the same way, that I needed to own a piece of the action in order to really have a commitment to the place. I needed to own something. But finally, Gary Fuquay said, I'll help you finance it. And so he helped me buy 10 acres that was already planted. It was planted in '72. I bought it in '84. So it was planted and producing already, so I could get an immediate income from it. And so I stretched myself as far as I could stretch financially and bought it and farmed it during 1984. Arthur Weber loaned me equipment for it, and I drove over from his place to my vineyard all of a sudden and did the tractor work and sort of managed it on the side. So my then wife and I decided, oh, we're going to get some income from it. Maybe we could afford to go to France for the first time and see how they do it in France. We had tried all these Burgundies and were intrigued by them and the differences between one region and the other, or one part of Burgundy from another. And so we made plans, figuring that, well, harvest will be over by middle of October and we can learn a little bit of French and get organized. But as it turned out, it was a very late year. Bloom was in July, but it started raining in September and never stopped, number one. Number two, this was before the age of crop estimation, where you could actually predict how many tons per acre, and by extension, how many cases per acre we were going to have. And this was in an era where crop levels sort of zigzagged up and down, and no one could figure out really why. But 1984 was the second, 82 being the first one, where the crop levels were much higher than were expected. And the assumption was, well, we'll just let them hang longer until they get ripe. But in Oregon, when the curtain closes, it closes. And in '84 in particular, it started raining in September and didn't quit. Literally did not quit. So there we were with grapes not quite over 18% sugar. That first year, after I bought the vineyard, I wondered, okay, where am I going to sell the grapes? That was an afterthought after I bought it. Oh yeah, you got to do something with the grapes, Alan. And I ran into David Adelsheim and said, oh, I'm going to have some grapes. And he goes, okay, we'll buy them. And there was tensions in the Knudsen-Erath camp at the time, such that I didn't feel like I could sell the grapes there. So I made a deal with Adelsheim to sell my grapes there, while the bulk of what I was managing was going to Knudsen-Erath, as well as much of the neighbors. Knudsen-Erath was the only winery on that road at the time, and they bought most of the surrounding grapes bought by other people, owned by other people. So there we got into the harvest season. Grapes were over 18% sugar, which is not ripe, and kept raining, and the grapes kept taking up more and more water, and by extension, more and more weight. And I remembered Dick Erath having a fit. Some grower brought a load of grapes up, and it wasn't on the shaded side. It hadn't fully colored up yet. And he took a cluster of grapes and threw it on the ground in front of the cellar and said, what am I supposed to do with this? I didn't know. And Adelsheim, where I was selling my grapes, that we had negotiated a price in advance on, he looked at me and was like, what am I going to do with this? He was polite. But he took the grapes, and we later had to negotiate a price downward, which I accepted. I understood they weren't quite right. But what I didn't understand at the time, not only about the quantity of grapes and the quality that was manifest in that quantity, is that it required the winery to have X number of fermenters for that amount of grapes, which Knudsen-Erath didn't have, because they never had that high of a crop load. And it required Y amount of people to do the work in processing the grapes, which they didn't have. And it led to a complete breakdown of the system. It wasn't set up for that quantity. And when they filled up all the fermenters, the rest of the grapes had to sit out in the field in the rain until they could finish the fermentation and make more room. So all those were lessons that were to be subsequently learned, but we didn't know at the time. And there I was against all that chaos in a late harvest. As it turned out, harvest ended like 2 days before our flight to France, and for the 2 days following, I had fermenters all over the countryside and equipment that I had to work to collect and consolidate, and didn't finish till the morning of the day of our flight, which is at night. So it was a real panic getting all organized. And then all of a sudden I woke up on the Champs-Élysées in Paris and was like, wow, one day I was eating burritos with the Mexican workers in the mud, and the next day I'm walking down Champs-Élysées having a petit déjeuner. And let's just say it was a culture shock. But we went to Champagne and went to Chablis and the Jura of Switzerland, and finally Burgundy, where I remember in Champagne, I went by myself to a pub to have an afternoon beer, and the French guys were in there talking, hee-hawing in French, and I almost had a deja vu where I could see German tanks in the streets. Like, I've been here, I've heard this story. Although my dad wasn't in Champagne drinking beer with German soldiers, I had a moment like, wow, there's history has happened here. And we ended up going to Burgundy, and we didn't know anyone there, but explored around. And, you know, it was obviously much more developed than Oregon was. Everything was planted up stem to stern. And it was like, wow. There was tasting rooms all over the place and restaurants. And I thought, wow, maybe Oregon could be like this someday. It was another aha moment that led me to believe Oregon had a future and reinforced my commitment to Project Oregon. So I came back to Oregon with renewed enthusiasm. Never mind the harvest of '84, that was behind me. Yes, I had to renegotiate the price down, but I got enough out of it that I could go to France for the first time, and on we go. So the next chapter began in '87. And leading up to '87, there were a few awards that Oregon wines received that sort of piqued the interest of outside parties. One was a tasting, I think it was in France, could have been London, where a wine from Irie, 75 Pinot Noir, came in the top flight against famous Burgundies. And the world kind of went, huh? Really? That came from Oregon? Most people then couldn't pronounce Oregon. It was Oregon. And I told my Kentucky buddies where I was living, is that next to Colorado? Well, kind of. There were some other awards that piqued the interest, but Oregon prior to '87 was sort of known for inconsistency, which was a function of the weather as well as the expertise, really, my own included. One interested party from the outside world was Brian Crozer of Petaluma Winery in Australia, in South Australia, and Roland Souls, his sidekick. They were interested in expanding. Brian had his own winery and wanted to expand his distribution into the U.S. and thought maybe having a winery in the U.S. would help him do that. But he saw the potential in Oregon and the inconsistency in it. And I walked the vineyards with him in 1985. He said, you know, you need irrigation. I'm like, what? This is Oregon. We don't need irrigation. But he brought that experience with him. We were known for inconsistency, and this is one thing we could do to minimize that inconsistency, then why not do it? And once he eventually got involved, we did. But he began poking around, tasting wines and looking at the land. And by 1987, he had hired me to join Argyle and start a sparkling wine project. His logic was, if life hands you a lemon, make lemonade. In other words, if the grapes didn't always get ripe, you could improve consistency by lowering your expectations and not getting the grapes as ripe. And sparkling wine doesn't have to be as ripe. So that made perfect sense. So he started a project making 20,000 cases in year one, which was ambitious by any stretch. But he hired me to go out and buy grapes around Oregon, and he leased my vineyard. It was a sort of a godsend. He gave me a job to manage my vineyard and then paid me to lease my vineyard. And so I didn't have agricultural risk for a long time during my employment with them. So I was up and down the valley buying grapes on their behalf in order to achieve the 20,000 case goal. It was exciting starting a new project with outside money. Brian had a partner in Brian's winery was Bollinger Champagne. So he had been to Champagne, he'd been to Europe, he had graduated from UC Davis and was a very technical, at the same time, charismatic guy, and became a real mentor. I ended up working with him for a long time, 15 years, I guess, directly. Another more notable example was Robert Drouin, Drouin, as you say, of Joseph Drouin Winery in Burgundy. He was a negotiant, and so he bought grapes up and down Burgundy from different villages and different producers, and as such had some examples of wine that were famous the world over. They owned their own vineyards as well. So he's a very well-known, famous company. He also got interested in Oregon. He had a daughter and 3 sons, and the French custom was to hand the business over to the sons. They never told me this. This was my deduction. But he wanted a project. He wanted to diversify his business. He had a daughter, so he bought land in Oregon and put his daughter in charge of it in 1987, the very same year that Argyle was launching, and bought a piece of land in the Dundee Hills, and the world kind of opened their eyes like, really? Joseph Drouin is going to invest in Oregon with their track record of such inconsistency? So Brian Crozer decided a whole new product, sparkling wine, in order to address that inconsistency. Robert Drouin wanted to improve the viticulture to address that inconsistency. So I was one of the few halfway experienced vineyard people in the area, and I was sort of disappointed that I didn't get a prompt interview with him to manage the vineyard. Argyle had started a vineyard management company. This was another piece of experience that they brought to Oregon. Quite often, ownership of a vineyard was 10 or 20 acres, not enough to justify employing someone full-time to run. So during the early days, sometimes I had to write 3 or 4 checks for an individual worker representing the 3 or 4 properties that they worked in, and being sure that I had the right number of hours for each vineyard and that it equaled 40 hours a week or whatever it was for that week. So they'd started a vineyard management company with no clients to begin with, but they brought the concept. Robert Druin announced plans to plant a vineyard, but I didn't get a call right away, which disappointed me. But in early February of 1988, I got a call from a friend, Bill Hatcher, who had signed on to be general manager. And early in the morning, he goes, "You want to manage DDO," which was an acronym for Domain Druin Oregon. And I'm like, "Well, Brian's in town, Brian Crozer. I'll ask him." And Bill asked me, "What if he says no?" I said, "I'll do it anyway." So it was a moment I asked Brian, and he was like, "Yeah, fine, go ahead." And so there I was in charge of 2 international companies planting vineyards in Oregon, and it was a wild time. I had occasion, Brian Crozer flew me to Australia in early '87 for their harvest, so let's say March, and it was a wild experience. I flew from Sydney to Adelaide, and these guys picked me up at the airport and said, "We're going for dinner," and it was already 6, 7 o'clock. I'm jet lagged, and we go and have dinner at a facility that's located at Petaluma Winery and Bridgewater Mill, and it keeps going on and on and on, late into the night, and bottle after bottle. And they said, "Well, we're going to go sample the grapes tomorrow morning, 5 o'clock. We're going to pick you up." Okay. And the night keeps dragging on, and so not only am I jet lagged, I'm short of sleep and a little bit hungover. And they pick me up at 5 in the morning, and they go, "We're hungover. How are you doing?" I'm like, "Fine." They go, "Okay, you drive." And so there I am, as dawn breaks in a completely strange land, driving on the left-hand side of the road, and going out to sample vineyards in the area that I'd heard of, Clare and Barossa Valley and all these different places. And I'd get out of the car and see the vineyards, but they were walking through the grass to get to the vineyard so they could sample grapes, and they were going, "Here, snaky, 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 snaky." And it's sort of like, "What are you doing?" And one of the most poisonous snakes in the world was a brown snake that caused these guys seriously to look for snakes between the car and the vineyard. 40 or 50 feet off the road was a vineyard, and they were scared of snakes. And so I was like, "Oh, where am I?" But along the way, I could see that the investment that they had far exceeded anything that existed in Oregon. So it was exciting to have signed on with them at that tender stage of my career and see what they were doing and bring it back to Oregon to begin implementing that. I forget, maybe early '89, Druins flew me to Burgundy, and that was an equally eye-opening experience. I sat down at Robert's kitchen table, and he brought up a bottle of wine from the cellar with no label. And he says, "It was before the war, I don't remember which," and had me taste it and try and guess what year it was. And I sat at the kitchen table and tried many wine with he and his wife and kids. Veronique was a daughter. Philippe was a son who was interested in vineyards and soon to become their chief vineyard manager for Chablis, Burgundy, and Oregon eventually. So those are both defining experiences that I had, and I brought back to Oregon. I was quite full of myself. Robert Druin, going back to my comment about wanting to improve the viticulture, was more aware than most of the clonal diversity that existed in Oregon, and realized that Oregon at the time just had 2 clones of Pinot Noir. And he's like, "Well, we can fix that." So he brought clonal awareness to the area and emphasized clones that he had experience with in Burgundy that he thought would improve the viticulture here. He also brought so-called high-density plantings, which was not widely adopted in Oregon, but was to a degree. But They had centuries of experience in Burgundy with techniques that hadn't been widely adopted in Oregon, and so the goal was to begin implementing them. And he brought one of the first high-density plantings in the New World. I mean, it was exciting. While I was in France, he took me to the factory that made these tractors, and I was in a room with engineers and him and me deciding about how to make a tractor for Oregon. And they were crapping on in French, and every now and then Robert would turn to me and say, well, in Burgundy we make a tractor a certain way, but Oregon we're not so sure. And here's the issue, what's the solution? I'm like, oh, I had to think on my feet and wing it the best I could. I had another experience in Burgundy where they gave me a car to go visit someplace, Robert did, and off I went. And I turned right on red, little knowing that turning right on red was not legal in France. And I happened to do so right in front of a cop car that was turning left in the oncoming lane. So they pulled me over, speaking French, and said, "La papier, s'il vous plaît." And I got it. Okay, the papers. And I searched around the car. I found the papers, and they kept crapping on in French, sort of aggressive a little bit. And finally they said, "Vous, moi." I was like, "Follow me." So I went to the police station, got hauled into the police station, and they kept crapping on in French. And I'm like, "Je ne parle français." I don't understand what you're saying. And finally, a guy like Inspector Courceau comes down from upstairs, and he has a coat and tie on, and he even starts off in French. I'm like, "Sorry." Finally, he converts to English and starts talking to me in English, and I had to pay. They called Robert to see if I'd stolen the car. No. And finally, they said to pay a fine, and I didn't have enough French francs on me at the time, so I said, "Credit card? You take credit card?" "No, pas de plastique, pas de plastique." And so eventually I came up with the money. I don't know how. But it was an adventure. So that went on all through the 90s, experimenting and trying to lift the game and for Brand, Oregon. Brian Crozer brought a different spacing with him that was more practical for the New World, that he had experience with in Australia, and it was more widely adopted. It became almost a standard planting in premium regions on the West Coast. So we were experimenting with new firsts for Oregon and gradually improved the viticulture throughout the 90s. One improvement came from within Oregon, and that was further refinement of crop estimation that I spoke about earlier. Steve Price, a guy that was employed by Oregon State, came up with a technique called lag phase, where you weighed the grapes 50 days after flowering, and assuming you got an accurate representation in that sample, you weighed them and you doubled that weight, and that's what you would have at harvest. So after 10 or 15 years, we finally had a technique where we could accurately estimate the crop. And that was a breakthrough moment where we could, for premium wines, we could thin down to a certain ton per acre figure, and for other sparkling wines, we could thin to a different one. It added a level of control that we hadn't had previously. One of the challenges of the 90s was the discovery of phylloxera, which is a soil-borne insect that devours own-rooted grapevines. And up until that point, because of cost considerations, all of Oregon was planted on susceptible rootstock. And for a period of time, we had doubts and anxieties about would there be any grapes at all. When we read the literature about how quickly it traveled in Europe in the 1800s, we could conceive of a scenario where all the vineyards died faster than we could replant them. It didn't turn out that way, but it was a watershed moment. And as a matter of fact, the discovery was in a vineyard adjacent to mine. And so I bought the property in '84, I built the house in '86. In 1990, right next door to me, we discovered phylloxera, and so I had high anxieties about that. But we managed, we began planting on resistant rootstock, and the supply was adequate for the demand. Robert Drouin had owned a distribution company in the U.S., and partly because of Brian's association with Bollinger, which had a relationship with Drouin in France, and to a much lesser degree, the association between the vineyards as executed by myself led to Robert's distribution company agreeing to distribute Argyle products. So Robert had this national system set up that other Oregon wineries were struggling to set up, but we were set up from the get-go with representation from around the country. We didn't have the name recognition, Argyle didn't, that Drouin did, but and we still made too much, 20,000 cases of one wine in year one. We had a new wine from a new region going into the national market. Let's just say it sat on the shelves for a bit, and we had to end up giving it away to airlines and that sort of thing to get exposure. But it was getting legs that didn't exist with the original pioneer wineries in terms of investment and expertise. It wasn't my money or my expertise, but I was executing with it. So life changed a little bit in the 90s. I've been through the 80s and 90s on the professional side. In 1990, I looked up and my wife was expecting, what led to a whole nother adventure. Christmas of '90, my son Jackson was born. And of course, like with anyone, life changed a little bit. We still had some adventure along the way. But we lived up on the hill in the middle. Oh, in '86, I built a house. I didn't get to that. But '84, I bought the vineyard. And 1986, I thought, well, better have my own place. It was getting to a time where the partnership that was Knudsen and Erath winery, in the winery per se, each man had his own vineyards that up to that point I had been in charge of. But that partnership was under strain, and one day Cal Knudsen comes up to me and says, well, we decided to break up, in so many words. And I was living up at the cabin on Knudsen Vineyards. It was about 800 square foot. It was well built. It had a beautiful view. But depending on how things worked out between Knudsen and Erath, I may have been looking for a place to live. And I thought, well, if Erath ends up owning the winery, I don't know what the future is, so I better build a house if I'm committed to this project that is Brand Oregon. And got this wild idea to build a house on my vineyard when financially it wasn't clear that I had the wherewithal to do it, but off we went and built a house in '86 and had my own place and my own vineyard with a 180-degree plus view of the Willamette Valley and the Cascades. And I remember when I originally bought the place thinking of the beauty that was involved. I'm like, wow, you can buy this, going back to all the adventures I'd had camping and hiking and exploring with my dad, beautiful places. I was like, really, you can buy this and maybe I could build a house on it? And so we did. And one thing led to another. My son was born in that house in 1990 and grew up there while the vineyard grew outside. There's a connection to the land that you don't get unless you have skin in the game. You look out the dining room window at dinner and think, oh, sunny day, the grapes grew today, that's good, we want them to grow. Or every day you see the development of the vineyard, and you think, oh, I have skin in that game, it's a good day. So my son grew up at the dinner table with wine talk and with vineyard talk, and before school I'd take him bouncing around different vineyards that I had to check on prior to take him to school. So he really grew up with that in mind. And we continued to travel some. We went to Europe a couple times with him when he was a small boy and exposed him to that, and traveled further, exposing him to family and that sort of thing. And so that was the family side of thing during the 90s, while simultaneously preoccupied with improving the viticulture for Brand Oregon. We had a son and a happy family time for a while. It was busy, but life changed, taking him to play events and Saturday morning soccer and that sort of thing. Life changed a little bit, but we bumped along. From a career standpoint, early in the 2000s, we were in Hawaii as a family, and I got a call from Brian Crozer on Christmas Day. Well, I had just gotten out of the water and picked up my then rudimentary phone, and he's calling me from Australia, and I was in Hawaii. He never called me at Christmas. I'm like, hi Brian, Merry Christmas. And he was emotional, I could tell from his voice, and told me he thought he'd just lost his winery in Australia, that it had been bought by a public company. I later met the merger and acquisition guy. Up to a certain point, I had no idea what a merger and acquisition guy was, but he said he went into a wine shop. He worked for a beer company, Lion Nathan, and they thought they were losing market share to wine, so they wanted to be in the wine business. Lion Nathan was a public company. And so the merger and acquisition guy said all he did was go into a wine shop in Sydney and see which wine was selling for the highest price that was publicly owned. And they made an offer on it that was well over share price at the time and bought it, lock, stock, and barrel. Brian was out. Didn't affect Argyle per se, but it was a monumental shift that eventually they acquired Argyle as well. And all of a sudden, we were owned by this giant international conglomerate that was owned in turn by Kirin Beer in Australia, who was owned partially by Mitsubishi. So it was this giant international conglomerate. And here we were, a little tiny outpost in Oregon. And it ushered in a new era. Around the same time, this is interesting, this is sort of the third phase of the Oregon wine business, where the early successes of the pioneers were sort of recognized, but the improved consistency achieved by Druin and Argyle and others attracted a much more risk-adverse investor genre, you might say. About that same time, a character in Napa was operating, and he convinced CalPERS, the California Retirement System, to invest in vineyards up and down the West Coast. Their name escapes me, their operating name escapes me now, but they bought and planted vineyards in California, and oh, by the way, why not in Oregon as well? Their initial was another example of giant corporate interest investing in Oregon that never would have 10 or 15 years earlier because it wasn't proven. They wanted a proven track record, and they were going to improve on it. through their business acumen, they thought. So they planted vineyards in Oregon. It got a lot of wide attention, 100-acre pieces. Bill Hill, this winemaker in Napa that convinced them to do this, took some ideas from California that ultimately were from France that improved the viticulture, better spacing. And their initial idea in Oregon was to plant some vineyards and then sell them to lifestylers. So they'd take a 100-acre piece, and the idea is, well, they can divide it into 5 20-acre pieces that had a home site approval on it and sell it for a big profit and flip them for quick profit for the California retirement system. One of the biggest investment firms, so to speak, in the U.S. was all of a sudden operating in Oregon. It was a bit of a shock, but it didn't work out that way. The recession of the late 90s, I forget, they couldn't achieve their original objective of flipping them and selling the property, so they decided to manage the vineyards and sell grapes for a period of time until the atmosphere improved. And I remember I bought grapes from them and learned about their people in vineyards buying grapes for Argyle on behalf of Argyle from some of the CalPERS properties. There was a silver lining in that all of a sudden they were supplying grapes to mom and pops that were all over the countryside selling brand Oregon, and they vastly increased the supply of grapes to other producers. But all that taken together introduced a certain corporatism that hadn't existed previously. Prior to that, it had largely been family-owned, people that were all on one page pulling for brand Oregon. All of a sudden we had these conglomerates that Argyle had HR people showing up all of a sudden talking to us about company culture and what our values were and that kind of thing. It was disheartening. We had Excel jockeys sending us spreadsheets from a terminal in an airport somewhere telling us how we ought to manage the vineyard. Like, huh? What? So it was a new chapter. Okay, so we sort of got through the 90s a little bit. In the early 2000s, 2002, I found myself as a single father. And so there Jackson and I were in the vineyard house. He was in middle school, and we were trying to figure out a new life together. But we lived together. We supported each other to the degree that we could. And about that same time, I began developing some medical problems. I had a knee replaced in 2004 that was painful and difficult recovery, and another one in 2007. So I was, a newly single father fighting with medical problems and trying to stay in the game from a career standpoint. And make the best of it, and we did. Jackson was a fine son and did his best in school and was a good boy. And I did my best to support him. From a career standpoint, around that time, I was giving vineyard tours to people from around the country that would come to visit Oregon. They were mostly tasting and visiting the wineries. But as a sideshow, they'd want a vineyard tour. And I'd take them out and show them all the razzle-dazzle vineyard stuff that we were doing. And someone from Dallas or Denver or wherever would say, well, is it organic? And I was like, no, why does that matter? But from a marketing sales standpoint, it did. And I put my heels in the dirt to the point where it was sort of a career terminating maneuver. Either I faced up to the demands of the market in one way or the other, or it could be a showstopper. And against everything else that was going on, I decided to go with the flow and keep a job that I needed under the circumstances that I found myself. And I got involved with LIVE, which is low input viticulture and enology, so LIVE. It was criticized a little bit as organic light in that it allowed for some pesticides, but it also considered the whole farm and had third-party inspections every year, and as such had some credibility. And I got on the board, and when I joined, I brought Domaine Drouin into the mix and Stoller Vineyard, which we began planting in '95, and Argyle, and quite a vineyard base and dues associated with that gave life to LIVE, play on words, at the time they needed it. And I got on the board and got interested in, okay, how can we be sustainable? And to my mind, that included an economic piece, that you had to be sustainable economically to stay in business in order to pay more attention to the environment. And I spent quite a bit of time at that, and it gave me some credibility to the marketing guys and to the corporate overlords that I found myself working for. They, the new ownership of Argyle, their playbook was to take all the back office functions and move them to a central location. So Lion Nathan owned Argyle, and they owned a couple wineries in California. They also had a distribution company, import company that they owned, and so they decided to move all the accounting and all that to Kansas City, Missouri, of all places. And so I used to be a check signer for Argyle, and I was a trustee for the IRA program, and all those functions got moved. And so what used to feel like a family affair felt like a corporate affair all of a sudden. I remember a merger acquisition guy coming through, and he was sort of tapping his leg nervously, talking about share price of the day. You know, it used to be we were on a mission and long-term development mission versus share price of the day. Anyway, they moved all the back office functions, which caused day by day to feel less and less like family and more like big business. About that same time, the International Pinot Noir Conference was developed. It wasn't my idea, but I participated in some of the seminars and tours, as well as the Oregon Pinot Camp, where wineries brought sellers, salespeople from around the country to Oregon and conducted tours for them. And the two events put together raised awareness quite a bit for Oregon. So during the 2000s, we bumped along, had good vintages. In 2004, there was a movie that came out called Sideways, and the people actually talked about Pinot Noir. They gave all of a sudden name recognition to a national audience what Pinot Noir was. Veronique Drouin used to tell a story that in Burgundy, when they sold Burgundy wines, it was Pommard or Volnay. They sold the village, the place that the wine came from, more than they sold it as Pinot Noir. So as such, Pinot Noir really didn't have much name recognition coming into the game. And I never traveled trying to sell because it wasn't my personality, but Veronique in particular used to go around selling wines in different markets, selling Oregon Pinot. Well, where's Oregon and what's Pinot? And they asked about what Pinot was because it had never been sold to them before. It had come to them as French villages, places. And so it was, the movie was widely considered a watershed moment. It was more than that, I'm sure, for the people that are out selling wine. But Oregon, Brand Oregon was getting name recognition. at the time. I remember meeting Jess Jackson of Jackson Family Wineries. He was visiting Dundee in the 90s, and we were always excited to get someone with name recognition from outside of the region to invest in Oregon, because it would give it credibility. And I asked him, are you going to do something in Oregon? He's like, nah, your yields are too low and the risk is too high. I mean, and he wasn't interested. But that gradually began to change. The movie Sideways, plus the marketing efforts, Oregon started getting traction, and life was good. We were selling wines and felt sustainable all of a sudden. Like, this is working, it's worked. All these efforts, decades, have paid off. On the other hand, it was sort of day-to-day disheartening with the corporate ownership, as I had mentioned. So, where are we? My son Jackson went off to college in 2009 to Humboldt State, of all places, because he was going to play football, and that was a school that would take him. And that was a sad moment for me when he went off to college, and I didn't know if I'd ever see him again. Didn't turn out that way. I saw a lot of him. But that was a watershed moment where it was sort of like mission accomplished. After single parenting for 10 years or so, off he went to college. Like, whew, all that for that. But that coincided with an interesting time career-wise. As I mentioned, Argyle's parent company owned a winery in California, and in the early teens-ish, they wanted me to go to California, of all places, and help them with crop estimation and other viticultural improvements that we had learned in Oregon that they weren't sure California had learned quite yet. Imagine that. So it was McCrosty Winery in Sonoma, and they bought grapes all up and down the Sonoma Valley. And there I was, sometimes with the principals, driving around to vineyards, but other times having an address and driving myself to one random vineyard after another for 2 or 3 days a stretch, dusk to dawn, doing crop estimation, which involved going out into these vineyards with a plastic bag and clippers and a hand scale. And I remember being out there, and some California guys, vineyard types, walked past me. They happened to be in the vineyard, and they go, "What are you doing?" "Well, I'm doing crop estimation." And they just kind of looked at me like I was nuts. Because in California, if you had more grapes than you were expecting, you could always sell them last minute to Gallo or to some big producer, or sell them in the bulk market, which was not an option Oregon had. It was life or death in Oregon, but in California, it just wasn't considered to be the case. And so we brought that concept to them about, okay, this is how many grapes you can expect. If you don't want that many, you can make a decision whether to thin off the excess or make plans in advance to sell them to another party, but this is what's coming. And I remember after going to one vineyard and sampling the grapes, generally I'd just dump the grapes on the vineyard floor and go on to the next block. In this case, I was so self-conscious, I took them to a ditch along the roadside and dumped the grapes so nobody would see them. But so it sort of took me away from Oregon a little bit. I looked up and I was managing nearly 500 acres up and down the valley. In 2008, we started planting Spirit Hill, and Argyle started planting Spirit Hill in the Eola Amities. And in '97, I forgot to mention this, we began planting Lone Star Vineyard, both of which took me out of the radius of Dundee, and all of a sudden my radius included Eola Amity, and then all of a sudden my radius was up and down the Willamette Valley as well as California. And it was sort of heady, but on the other hand, daunting. And about that time, after we'd planted these 2 vineyards, Argyle's parent company says, well, we need more grapes. I'm like, really? You know, up until that time, it sort of felt like if we grew, we'd grow in price. We could raise the price level, and that would lower the demand and keep supply and demand in sync. But anymore, the corporate types thought, well, let's keep the price the same or maybe even discount it, and that means we need more grapes. And so I was up and down, further up and down the Willamette Valley, looking at land for them. And about that same time, CalPERS decided the climate was good enough that they could sell the properties that they had developed a decade earlier in Oregon. They could finally sell it, and maybe for a small profit, but they could get out with their skin. I did due diligence on behalf of Argyle of 2 or 3 of the CalPERS properties, one of which was Rose Rock in the Amity Eola Hills, where I had bought grapes previously on behalf of Argyle, and as such had been down there sampling grapes prior to the harvest, helping Argyle determine the ripeness. We actually made a bid on that, but Argyle's parent company was kind of slow to the draw. It required corporate approval and God knows what. It was upstairs from where I lived. We made an offer on Rose Rock, and lo and behold, Druin got the winning bid because they were family owned and could make a decision sooner. And that was sort of a blow, you know, to me. I put time into it and didn't get it, but still the pressure was on. Argyle wanted more land, and I looked at bare pieces of land here and there and never got any traction until another property came up that I looked at, did due diligence on, and looked around. It was down near Monmouth, so way out of my range, and I had no idea how I was going to manage something if Argyle bought something that far away. But anyway, we made a bid on it and didn't get it because they were slow to the draw. I found out who bought it, and it was Atlas Vineyard Management, which is a group formerly associated with CalPERS, who had a big vineyard management service in California, and they were expanding into Oregon, and they made an offer on this piece down near Monmouth and got it. Well, I knew one of the principals. Used to work from Mondavi back in the 90s when we used to have sort of a cross-border exchange of information, and I thought, that guy's too smart to buy a vineyard and just to sell grapes. But whatever, I approached him about a partnership between themselves and Argyle and made the introduction to him and my new boss. And it finally got traction, and it worked. Argyle was 50% owner in this vineyard down near Monmouth, and glory hallelujah, this Atlas Vineyard Group was going to manage it. So all of a sudden, Argyle had the source that it wanted, and I didn't have to manage it. It was a big win. About that time, I continued to have medical problems, ultimately resulting in spinal fusion surgery in 2015. But I was in a good deal of pain leading up to that in 2014 and 15. But I managed, and I limped through until 2000. So I turned 60 in 2014, and bit by bit, the corporate vultures sort of chase out people as they hit their 60s, and partly as a result of the surgery and the recovery that I experienced, but also because of the ownership at the time. I sort of got shoved out of Argyle in 2017 and officially retired, and that led to another period of like, okay, what's next? What comes next? And it was partially solved in 2018 when Chemeketa called me, Chemeketa Junior College called me out of the blue and asked if I would teach a class. They had a vineyard management and a winemaking class, and so I started teaching for them in 2018, just one class a quarter, but it took tremendous energy to organize curriculum and present it on a weekly basis. But it was, it got me out there, and I felt rewarding to share my experience. The students seemed interested, and felt good. Just prior to the pandemic, I bought a beach house trying to make room at the vineyard for the kids to grow their business. And I bought a beach house so I'd have a place to go so they could do their thing and I do my thing. But once the pandemic hit, it was glory hallelujah. If I ever got cabin fever, I could just say, forget it, I'm going to the beach. And often went alone. But between teaching the class and having the beach house, I stayed fulfilled. The Chemeketa thing ended with the pandemic. Everything went into lockdown, and Chemeketa wanted a full-time instructor rather than a part-time instructor, and they finally found one, and that coincided with the pandemic, and that ended that brief career until, I don't know, 2021. Linfield called, of all places, and wanted me to teach a class, and which I did. Their program was more wine-related, and I decided that the mandate was to teach these wine business students how to talk to vineyard people. They had to know at least what the issues were in order to be able to intelligently discuss the business aspects with vineyard people. And so that was a different experience, but I enjoyed it, and we went on field trips, and it was during the fall quarter, so harvest was underway after a few in-class sessions, so we made plenty of field trips, met with Ken Wright and others while harvest was going on, so I think it was a rewarding experience for them. So here I am on the edge of turning 70 and wondering what life has in store for me. I feel like I've had a great adventure up until now. I used to think there was 2 chapters in life. One was when you have time and no money. The second was when you have money and no time. Did I say that right? I've now decided there's 3 chapters to life. One is when you have health, time, and no money. The second is when you have money, health, and no time. The third is when you have money, time, and no health. And so I continue to struggle a little bit with health problems, but I seem to be on the uptick. I'm looking forward. What's there to look forward to at age 70? Well, plenty in my case. I continue to enjoy the beach house. My partner, and I have a trip planned to the Grand Canyon. It's been on her bucket list, and I was there last when I was 7 or 8, I think. And so we're going to have a little adventure. So I enjoy traveling, and during the days of my single parenting, wasn't able to. And during the days of health issues, I further wasn't able to do as much travel as I did at one chapter in my life. So I look forward to that. And as I mentioned, I still go to the beach house. I go to the gym almost every day, try and stay in shape. And I continue to enjoy the nature and beauty that Oregon has to offer, and look forward to motor trips to places beyond the beach to let that further sink in. And meanwhile, my son Jackson has taken over the vineyard and built a thriving wine business, and aha, mission accomplished. We've achieved a multi-generational farming enterprise with value added in a beautiful place that people appreciate. And so, yeah, again, mission accomplished. What's more to do than to enjoy life after all that I've accomplished? And enjoyed having grandkids, Louie and Odella, and enjoyed seeing them bounce around the vineyard and laughing and tasting grapes. And like, wow, how'd it go by so fast? But anyway, that's it.